Welcome back to This Day Live, the Sunday talk show here on the Arise News channel. With me, I have Professor Bola Akinterenwa, Director General, Polytech Center for International Diplomacy and Strategic Studies, and Professor David Awurawa, Professor of International Relations and Strategic Studies at the University of Lagos, Nigeria. Well, profs, you've listened to our two guests, three major issues that we've been able to focus on so far. Election violence in Nigeria, and along with that, litigation challenges faced by INEC. And then secondly, of course, the US midterm elections. And then third, the latest development with regard to the update of the security alert issued by the British authorities with regard to security in Nigeria. Those broad issues. First, let me begin with you, Professor Akinterenwa.
Yeah, I think that the submission of the senior advocate of Nigeria, Kunle Adegoke, he made a number of valid points that require particular attention. So did our colleague in the US, Shikamodi. Now, to begin with the postulations of Kunle Adegoke, he mentioned the point that 50% of the court petitions, focused on the constitution of other political parties, not observations, not petitions dealing with the constitutions of the political party to which the petitioners belong. And I found this quite interesting to the extent that even though the senior advocate is trying to give the impression that, well, it creates a sort of deluge, many petitions for the justices to handle. As much as is correct, I want to look at it from another perspective to say it is quite good. If, for instance, someone is petitioning, complaining about non-constitutionality of the processes of nomination of the other party, that is developing democracy. That is promoting constitutionalism. He is now trying to say that if a political party, let's say PDP, let's say APC, now someone, an observer, who is not a member of APC, who is not a member of PDP, is now trying to say, look, you didn't follow the process. That clearly shows that, look, they are trying to say, please follow due process. If you do follow due process, then we will be making progress along, a logical direction, which is quite good. I found that particular research observation of his saying that about 50%. But let's even set aside the percentage to note that, look, some people are monitoring what is happening in the other parties. So the parties petitioned against should also do the same thing. And I think this will help the democratic processes. The second point is that the issue of professionalism of the police force. The president talked about it. Kunle Adegoke mentioned it, and I asked myself, actually, when do we believe that a policeman behaves professionally? When we talk about professionalism, it is more about tactical behavior. All right? For me, professionalism should be seen, explained, and understood from the perspective of tactical strategies. But now, the critical point is that the rule of obeisance a policeman does not operate simply based on his own tactical knowledge, experience acquired over the years. There is the political will too that directs. When something happens in a given state, we have been told that, theoretically speaking, it is the governor of the state that is the chief security officer. But the commissioner of police does not in any way, is not accountable directly to the governor. It is to the inspector general of police. So instructions are generally given to policemen to perform this way or not this way. So as to the independentist character of the policeman, I do not think that any policeman can act contrarily to instructions coming from above. This type of situation should be differentiated from when you send Nigerian policemen, Nigerian soldiers out internationally to go and fight. You now know that, look, the Nigerian soldiers, the Nigerian policemen are well trained, they are real professionals. They know how to achieve their targets without any political will of anyone. But when it is within Nigeria, the situational reality is completely different. Completely different. When Martin Luther, the general, and one general, Wakuo, I can remember, the United Nations specifically requested, appeal to the government of Nigeria that they want XYZ to be sent to either Sudan for this peacekeeping something. They are performing very well. Nobody complains about them. So here, when we talk about professionalism in Nigeria, please, it is not that they are incompetent or they are not professional. It's simply because you have some environmental conditions that prevent them. And one last point there is you see, when we are talking about violence, I think this is more or less a manifestation of protest against the government. When you now see people unnecessarily carrying violence to the doorsteps of the police, to law enforcement agents, people attacking presidential candidates, no. The problem should not just be seen in the context of a crisis and a conflict. You see, the problem is that things are not normal in Nigeria, and it is within the context of these situations that are not normal that we should explain everything. And this brings me to Professor Shika Modi. He talked about Donald Trump's in response to our own Dr. Abati's observation, which in itself is very categorical. Trumpism, is it not winning? And so on and so forth. And the travel alert, how do we explain that? Dr. Modi said, well, it's okay, but there is double standard. When we are understanding the word double standard in this case, it is important for us to seek a clear understanding of what we should mean and what the purpose of an advisory, travel advisory should imply. When, for instance, an alert is given in the American world, because he gave the example of Mexico, that they wouldn't give any travel alert. Yes. Do you have the same threat in Mexico as we do have in Nigeria? The threat in Nigeria is about protecting the strategic interests of the United Kingdom, of the United States in Africa in general, Nigeria in particular. It's quite different from threats against the Americans. Now, for instance, how many Americans are killed or kidnapped in Mexico, in Latin America? It is the strategic interests in Nigeria that are at stake, and the diplomatic agents that are here that are required to to monitor, to ensure that there are no threats to them. That's what is at stake. So for them, the statement accredited to the United Kingdom, for instance, what does it really mean? You are no longer going to give advice, for instance, on this travel allowance, but or accepting, essential travels. Why essential travels? If you know that, I will just put it this way to say, look, when you see total ban, you say don't go to particular states, total ban. That means that those states fall under high level, risk. Then when you say these states, yes, you can go there, but be careful. That seems that they are talking about medium level risks. And when you now say don't go to the border, 20 kilometers to the border between Kebbi and Niger something, you are simply saying that that particular area is most critical in terms of risk. So in this case, I think the main submission here is that the United Kingdom is telling Nigerians that, look, we have threats there permanently, but in some areas you can control them. In conclusion, I will say that, look, a British Prime Minister told the whole world during Anonga, United Nations General Assembly, that in Abuja and FCT in general, that there is a training ground for terrorists. It was widely, openly said. Nigerian ambassador was there, permanent representative. What is it that has been done? The school where they are training terrorists in Abuja, is the school still there? We need an answer.
Okay, Prof. At this point, I would like Professor Awurawa to address some of these issues that we have identified so far.
Thank you very much. I would like to begin with Mr. Kunle Adegoke's submission on the elections and threats to possible threats to the election. He highlighted 3 key areas. It began with violence, then he talked about litigations, and then he summed up by talking about police and professionalism of the police and the impact it is likely to have on the elections. These are the areas they address. I would like to begin with the violence issue, because I see that as the greatest threat. He spoke well. He spoke well because he didn't just highlight what the issues are. He also emphasized what needs to be done for that threat not to, derail the elections. He emphasized one point over and over again. He reiterated it over and over. And that was the point that when people perpetrate violence and commit offense, they should be promptly brought to justice. That when they are promptly brought to justice, it will serve as a deterrent to others. Others will see that if they go that route, they will be arrested and prosecuted. And that would deter them. He, emphasized that over and over again. Of course, that is just logical and commonsensical, that when crime is committed and those who commit crime are not prosecuted, they are emboldened. Others are emboldened to continue to commit crime. But when crime is committed and there is prompt response and those who commit the crime are brought to justice, it deters, would-be criminals moving forward. And what I would like to add, the addendum I would like to make to this is that these criminals who want to, threaten the election, I can categorize them into 3. The first category are insurgents who don't believe in Nigeria, who don't believe in democracy, and who don't think the elections should hold. Their position is of concern because it's ideological and they are passionate about it. Boko Haram, ISWAP, those in the east who also say Biafra and all that, they all belong to this category. They are difficult to handle because they are passionate and they are committed to that cause. But the police can do it. It was done in 2015 when, before the general election, when the elections were postponed, and Borno and Yobe, that were the hotbeds at the time, efforts were made to clear, these terrorists and elections held. So we've done it before, it could be done again. That is the first category. The second category are criminals that are sponsored by, political leaders. What they do is to try to target the strong areas of the opposition, of the other party, such that votes or voting will not take place, to reduce the number of votes that will go to the other candidate. That also is difficult to handle because the politicians are always very powerful and their faces are not out. They are giving the support, but nobody is seeing them. We saw it in Lagos, we saw it in other places in Nigeria in the last election. Again, if the police rise to the occasion, they should be able to, but it is difficult, just like, the insurgents. The third category are just criminals who want to just disrupt the election and possibly also steal, they want to invade INEC offices, cut away things and all that. This third category are the easiest to handle because police can just go after them and deal with them. Whatever it is, the police have their work cut out. And that takes me to the second point, which is police professionalism, which Mr. Adekoke talks about. The Nigerian police is very professional, just like Professor Akintenewa has said, which is why they do very well when they go outside the country. But political interference is a major issue. The government has to look for a way to ensure that the police does its job professionally for them to be successful in this regard. In the last election, I was a returning officer, and I know the role the police play in making the election go well. I also know the role the police play in not making the election go well. There were areas where the police were acting as if they were agents of a particular political party, which is not right. In fact, I even clashed with them a couple of times on account of that. So the IGP will not stop by just saying troublemakers will be dealt with. He should first, address his men. What they do or fail to do will impact on the election as whether it is successful or whether it is not. Then the other two issues, litigation, of course, those ones will be handled and dealt with. INEC would go ahead and abide by court ruling in which candidate is accepted. But of course, the less of those litigations we have, the better for everybody. The elections, will they go well? We hope they will. If there is a will, there will be the way to be able to, for things to go smoothly. And going smoothly will be good for everybody because it will ensure stability and people will be able to move on with their lives, after the election. Professor Modi talked about the midterm election. I wasn't surprised at the results. I'm surprised that people are surprised. I would have been surprised if the Republicans did as well as was projected. This is because people don't tend to make a distinction between the Republican Party and in the primaries and the general elections. Trump was extreme when he did well in some areas, but he was extreme. Especially that January 6th attempt to subvert the elections. So many independents who are not aligned to any political, who normally would not want to support the Republican Party. Trump can make all his noise in the Republican Party and get all the votes. But when it comes to the election, people will not support. And that is the challenge that the party faces at this time. So I wasn't surprised at all at the results of the midterm elections. Well, travel advisory, yes. A fortnight ago when I spoke about it, I did say that I would like us to focus on the message and not the messenger. And by that I said, well, they've made point, they've talked about advisory, they've talked about credible threat to security. They even gave, examples of the attempt to, harm some diplomats here and there. That we should focus on the message or not the messenger. Whether they shot in Alabama, that should not be our headache. Our headache should be the point they have made. How can we respond such that we are secure? Unfortunately, the government responded like that. Abuja was all over the place, security men trying to comb the place and all that, and we're all happy for it.
Even though they denied.
Well, it doesn't matter. Now that they are downgraded, we are also happy. And what we always say is that we should not drop the ball. We should continue to be consistent in, ensure that all the threats, attention is paid to them and security is provided. So I will congratulate us, I will congratulate the government and security forces for their swift response and the fact that, these things didn't lead to a breach, of the peace.
Okay, let's move on. Let's take another topic. Developing countries need to work with investors, rich countries, and development banks to secure $1 trillion a year in external financing for climate action by the end of the decade, and to match that with their own funds, according to a report released on Tuesday. The report was published ahead of talks on climate change finance at the COP27 summit in Egypt, and indicates that the funding is required to cut emissions, boost resilience, deal with damage from climate change, and restore nature and land. It further indicates that the total annual investment requirement of developing countries will hit $2.4 trillion by 2030, where that report is by the Climate Policy Initiative, that between 2020 and 2030, the world will require about $2.4 trillion. Now, last year at Glasgow, at COP26, the developed countries had made a pledge of making available $100 million per annum to provide support in what is called climate financing, or what you call climate change diplomacy, which is clearly, what COP, the Conference of the Parties, has become. But the major issue is that this particular COP, also called COP Africa, Africa is hosting it. Africa is also a victim. The pledges were made in Glasgow last year. Today, there's a lot of talk about implementation and cooperation and climate adaptation, which will include financing, technological support, the commitment of the developing world. However, is COP27 being held in Nigeria, in Africa, in Egypt, at Sharm el-Sheikh? Will it be consequential for Africa? Will it be consequential for the developing countries? Many of these countries think that the developed world is just hypocritical. After all, in Glasgow last year, they said they were going to cut, drastically cut investment in coal, right? But they've now said, no, that will not be eliminated. It will be phased cutting. The scientists have reported that the projection of, limiting global warming to about 1.5 degrees Celsius has not been met, because the developed countries have not been keeping to their words, and that in fact the target that has been set may not even ever be met. The US, President Biden, yes, spoke, acknowledged the scale of the problem, talked about the US providing support. But what are we really dealing with here? The climate adaptation that is being talked about, the financing that is being talked about, the technology that is being talked about. With Pakistan, which lost over 1,700 people to floods this year alone, saying that whereas it contributes only 1% to global warming, it suffers more. It's the 8th most devastated country in the world. But the countries of the world that cause these problems, they seem not to be doing enough. Are we going to get any sincerity out of all the commitments that are now being made at Sharm el-Sheikh? Let me start with you, Professor Awurawo.
To begin with, let me begin with the positive. The positive is that the consciousness regarding environmental protection is growing and expanding. You have to have that consciousness first, that there is a need to do something drastic to save the environment. And multilateral efforts to protect the environment continue to widen. That is the positive. But to come to the specific question you asked regarding whether there is no hypocrisy and all that, all the targets that have been set since the global system began to set targets regarding environmental protection, limiting pollution of the environment and reducing the percentage of warming. None of it has ever been met over the years. None of it has ever been met. But of course, countries make efforts to push towards it, but it has never really been the case that when countries make promises on these issues, they're able to meet the promises. China, United States are the biggest polluters. They have made promises all over the place, and every time they return to say, oh, we are sorry, we couldn't meet the target, we will try next time. This last one we had in Africa, and I'm happy that attention has been drawn to the African case. What assistance they will render Africa to ensure that Africa is able to, contribute to environmental protection. We heard that the promise they made the last time requires that they would give 277 billion to Africa. But out of that, only about 80 was given, so 200 billion less than they promised. I mean, that's just encapsulated, that summarizes the failure and disappointment of the efforts to really tackle the environmental crisis that we face. But from what has happened this year, it is existential. And the earlier the world realized the need to push faster, the speech that the Secretary General of the United Nations gave, he said we're on the highway to hell. That was how he described it, portraying, how bad and how existential the threat is. So what one would say is that beyond the rhetoric and beyond the empty promises, moving forward, the developed countries need to do more, and they need to fulfill their promises so that we can reduce, the crisis that the environment faces.
Well, I mean, it's good you mentioned the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He seems to be the only one that is very clearly on the side of the developing countries, because a country like Pakistan and also Barbados, whose prime minister also spoke, are calling for what they call climate justice, as opposed to humanitarian assistance. But most of the other, countries, the developed countries, they're talking about loss and damage. And, you have Antonio Guterres and others saying, no, it's not about humanitarian assistance. It's about justice, climate justice. Will anybody get justice from these proceedings?
Thank you,
Prof.
for landing on the distinction between humanitarian assistance and climate justice. In fact, those are the two critical elements of the issues. I had the opportunity of going with my foreign minister to the climate change conference in Copenhagen, when the issue of financing began to take shape. And the problematic that was identified then was simply who is most responsible for pollution, for the problem. And in this case, shouldn't the heavy polluters be more responsible in terms of financing? These were the two perspectives, conflicting perspectives there. I remember vividly well that Nigeria and some other countries, particularly African countries, were saying, no, we should not be held responsible in this case. And that the more developed countries, the industrial countries, should accept full responsibilities. That was the starting point. Now, the pledges that were made thereafter, Professor Awurawo and you, Dr. Abati, also mentioned the hypocritical, pillar. They know quite well that, look, they didn't US make, a conditionality before paying. So we know quite well that the intention to pay is not there. The political will to pay, to fund, is not there. But impression is given that, okay, we will try to do whatever is possible. The promise of $100 million that you are mentioning, please, they have been talking about all this. Not until African people, African diplomats, African diplomatic machinery focuses greater attention in understanding international diplomacy. That, look, international diplomacy, the beauty of it all is to tell you what you want to hear. That's the issue. So they tell us what we want to hear, you clap and you go back home. But at the end of the day, nothing will happen. My own concern, whether it is climate justice, whether it is humanitarian assistance, like we differentiate, or we tell the whole world that, look, we want trade. Trade with us, not economic assistance. Reports have shown, climate research has shown that Lagos, for instance, is less than 2 meters already below sea level. And they have predicted that come 2050, that Lagos Island will be overtaken by the high seas. Now, that shows that we are directly affected by design, by strategic calculations. What are we doing there? Is it the financing that will be discussed in Egypt that is going to help us? Please, this is a question for anybody to answer. Climate change, climate adaptation, all these are beautiful questions on paper. But how do we save ourselves of the impending problem of Lagos being overrun by high seas?
Okay, thank you, Prof. It's time now for a break here on This Is Live, the Sunday talk show. When we return, we'll be discussing the decision of the Nigerian government to recommence operations on the Abuja-Kaduna train service after last March's terrorist attack along that route. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to This Is Live, the Sunday talk show here on the Arise News channel. I still have with me Professor Bola Akinterenwa, Director General, Bolitag Center for International Diplomacy and Strategic Studies, and Professor David Awurawa, Professor of International Relations and Strategic Studies at the University of Lagos. Let's take one more topic. Now, after being shut down for more than 8 months due to a terrorist attack, the Abuja-Kaduna train is set to resume operation this month. Meanwhile, the All Progressives Congress-led federal government has described as a cruel irony the accusation of non-performance by the opposition People's Democratic Party. Arise correspondent Amaka Ude Walker has more.
Since the 28th of March, the Abuja-Kaduna train services has remained suspended following the death of 8 passengers and the abduction of over 60 people. Although all abducted victims have now been released, the service had remained suspended. The Minister of Transportation, while confirming that the services will resume to commuters this November, says infrastructural development has been a key focus of the APC administration, and the Nigerian waterways, rail, road and/or air transportation are better off as a result of the progress made by the administration.
The President Muhammadu Buhari-led administration has made giant strides in bridging the infrastructural deficit in the transportation sector, like it has done in other sectors. We have the railway modernization program that I talked about, the deep sea ports development program, the inland dry port initiatives, job creation, introduction of favorable policies, to mention but a few. The sector is far from perfect, but the interventions on ground will serve as a veritable template for the incoming administration. The railway modernization program has a plan to link every state capital by rail.
And as the Buhari-led administration winds down, the federal government, which started the scorecard series with the Minister of Works and Housing last week, says if it was the opposition that was in government with the COVID-19 pandemic and 2 recessions, there would have been a total economic shutdown. And while highlighting the achievements of the transportation sector, the Minister of Information says those criticizing President Buhari are biased, and it is a cruel irony as the results are evident, especially as it concerns infrastructural development.
It is a cruel irony that the party that presided over the affairs of this great country in a time of plenty but could not complete a single modern rail line is the one accusing an administration that has completed at least 3 standard gauge rail lines of lacking achievement. Indeed, the Buhari administration is spoiled for choice in celebrating its achievements.
The Buhari administration scorecard 2015 to 2023 series continues with the Minister of Aviation, Humanitarian and Disaster Management, as well as Interior, expected to appear. Amaka Ude-Walker, Arise News.
Okay, there you have it. After the terrorist attack on that Kaduna-bound train from Abuja on March 28, about 8 persons were killed, many more were injured, over 60 persons were abducted by the terrorists. And it was until first week of June that the first batch of 11 persons regained their freedom. And others were released in batches until September 6, 2022, when the remaining 23 persons were released. There were stories about the brutalization, dehumanization of the persons. There were stories about ransom being paid. There were stories about all kinds of negotiations, including backroom negotiations and all of that. Now, the train service along that route was shut down in March. Now, the Minister of Transport is saying the train service would resume in November. No specific date has been given. What is the guarantee that that particular route or any other train route is safe for Nigerians? We're told security precautions have been taken. What kind of security measures have been put in place to monitor that route in order not to tempt the terrorists monitoring that route to abduct people again? 2, will people have the confidence to even take the train to Kaduna, Abuja in either direction, given the experience that we have had in this particular regard? Some people have said, petty traders in the stations, their system will, their trading activities will resume. Even Railway Corporation itself, the NRC, will begin to get revenue. Are those the issues? Or the fact that after that attack, we have also had other incidents in other places, either of the rail lines, the gauges being stolen, or other attacks, and creating a general problem of insecurity along the railway network. Let me start with you again, Professor Awurawa. We have very limited time.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll be very brief. The resumption of operations on Abuja, Kaduna, the question that I would like to ask is the question you have just asked. What measures have been put in place to ensure that when operations resume, there will be safety? The question of whether Nigeria Railway Corporation will make money, or the sellers or traders will, that is just, those are not the issues. The issues are when operations resume, would travelers on the rail be safe? It shouldn't be a joke, because it will be a disaster of immense proportion. If the operations resume, we have another attack that is carried out successfully. That is much I will say about that. The second issue, which has to do with government performance, I would like to just speak as a professional and as an academic. Yes, the projects they've listed, they are fine, they are good, and they are real, you can see them. My problem with it is that there are 2 issues. One, after 7 years, were we expecting the government not to do anything at all? Those things are too few, they are inconsistent. You can count them at your fingertips. That is one. 2, these things were done with money borrowed, not wealth generated. So there is, and when the government is about to go, and you have people waiting for it to quickly go so another one can come, it raises questions as to whether that government has really made an impact, as like Mohammed and all the other ones are saying. I would not like to leave it at that.
Well, Professor Akintenwa.
Dr. Abati and Professor Awurawa are more interested in the security measures that have been taken. I don't think we should be talking about all those things. Security strategies will never be made known. It should be peculiar to them. You make that one known, then you are selling your strategies to your enemy. So at the end of the day, the security measures should not be a big deal, even though we can have an idea of what it's all about, if you can contribute to that. What we should be more interested should be on the dead, the living and the future. Those people that died, for instance, what is it that has been done, let's say by the railway management to see that at least there is compensation given them? On the living, you've just mentioned it. Which way forward? Strategically speaking, terrorists will not bother about Abuja-Kaduna rail, bearing in mind that some security measures will have been taking place. They will go and focus attention on another route. So this is what the management should be looking at to ensure security for all others. And for the future, please, you see, the issue of security generally should be addressed holistically and not just on a piecemeal Abuja-Kaduna rail security.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Bola Akintoye, and thank you to Professor David Awurawo. You've been watching This Day Live, the Sunday talk show, here on Arise News. I'm Ruben Abati. From our entire team here in Lagos, it's bye for now, and thank you very much for watching.